According to Billboard, the Beatles hold the record for the most #1 singles with 20 #1 singles. Although the Beatles broke up 53 years ago, and there have been many other popular musicians since then, none have been able to surpass this record yet. And that speaks to the significance of the Beatles. My credentials for talking about the Beatles are that I'm a big Beatles fan, and I even saw Paul McCartney, a former Beatle, last year in concert. I think it's important for you guys to know about the Beatles because they made a big impact in music and in pop culture. And my goal for this speech is for you guys to know a little bit more about the Beatles and have like a takeaway at the end. So today we're going to talk about the Beatles as individuals, then we're going to talk about the Beatles music, and then we'll talk about the influence of their music. Alright, so first we're going to talk about the individual members and their contributions to the group. First up is John Lennon. John played rhythm guitar, and he was part of the songwriting partnership with Paul McCartney. John had a troubled childhood, and he used this experience as inspiration for some of his songs. After the band broke up in the early 70s, John joined the peace movement and protested against the Vietnam War. And he released his song Imagine, which some of you may know. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1980 at the age of 40. Next up is Paul McCartney. Paul plays bass guitar, and he's the other half of the songwriting partnership with John. So John and Paul wrote the vast majority of the Beatles songs, or the Beatles music. And although Paul also drew from personal experiences, his songs tended to be more optimistic than John's songs. And he also was the driving force, Paul was, behind their more innovative ideas and concepts in music. Paul, after the Beatles broke up, had a very successful solo career, and he is still touring today at the age of 81. Next up is George Harrison. George played the lead guitar, and he also wrote songs, but not until the later years of the group. So as he developed his songwriting skills, his songs got better and better. And he has some of the band's greatest hits, such as Here Comes the Sun and Something. In the late 60s and 70s, George got into Hinduism more. He was more of like the spiritual Beatle. And unfortunately, in 2001, he died of lung cancer. Last but not least is Ringo Starr. Ringo was the drummer for the Beatles, and although he joined last, he was a very valuable addition because he was considered the best drummer in Liverpool, which was the city where all four Beatles came from. And his catchphrase is peace and love, which he uses in almost every one of his Instagram captions. And he is 83 years old today. All right, now that we've talked about the individual members, let's now talk about their discography. So, they had 13 studio albums, and according to Rolling Stone, their first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1960. Their first album, Please Please Me, was released the following year. Their first 5 albums were good. I still listen to them, and they're really good, but they were kind of similar to each other, and they didn't really break the mold of what was expected of pop music at that time. With the 6th and 7th albums, Rubber Soul, which I have here, and Revolver, the Beatles became a little more innovative. They used things like orchestra in their songs. They used fuzz bass, different lyrical experimentations, stuff like that. But it wasn't until Sgt. Pepper's when they got really innovative. They really pushed at the boundaries of what pop music could be, and they it was very experimental and psychedelic. So this is them in that period a little more. Their last album, Let It Be. So their next couple albums were also very innovative and probably the most memorable of the Beatles' discography. Here's Abbey Road, which is probably one of the most prevalent images of the Beatles, is this album cover. And their last album, Let It Be, was released in 1970, only a month after the Beatles officially broke up. Now that we've talked about the Beatles' music, let's talk about their influence on music. The Beatles inspired more singer-songwriters. So when John and Paul were writing songs and singing them, that wasn't very common back in that time. Usually it would be an older group of writers would write a song for a young idol. And John and Paul would write songs that spoke to their personal experience, which also was not as common, and it allowed the listener to relate to the music more. So, for example, Nowhere Man was based on John's state of mind, and Here, There, and Everywhere is Paul talking about his love for his then girlfriend, Jane Asher. In addition to their... So yeah, this inspired many songwriters to come. In addition to their influence on singer-songwriters, they inspired more creativity in the studio and with instruments. So they used instruments that weren't really used in pop music at that time, such as the orchestra in Yesterday or the sitar in Norwegian Wood. And the use of these instruments paired with the personal lyrics helped the listener feel the emotions the Beatles were trying to convey in these songs. And their music influenced many musicians to come. So the guy with the guitar right there is Roger Waters. He was the bassist and the songwriter for Pink Floyd, which was a band in the 70s and 80s. And he talked about the Beatles saying, "It was okay to write about our lives and express how we felt. It gave me and my generation permission to branch out," which is quoted in You Discovered. And more recently, Lady Gaga said about Abbey Road, "It's so incredibly brilliant, an innate sense of joy. They really had that down." And so that just speaks to how the Beatles are still significant today. All right, in conclusion, the Beatles are made up of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They had 13 studio albums, and these albums have made a big impact on the music landscape. I hope you guys have learned something about the Beatles today, and thank you.